Hi everyone. And it is good afternoon. I've just checked the time and it is good afternoon, so I'm very, very pleased with that. As Amanda just pointed out, I'm here today to talk about pathological demand avoidance, or PDA, and I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to give a small oversight about PDA. PDA is quite a contentious ideal, which I will go through why there are certain contentions around its use as a diagnostic, as part of the ASD umbrella. And most importantly today, I really, really want you to take something away from this, dependent on your levels of understanding and maybe a different conceptual way of looking at something. And that's where we're going to be using the PANDA approach to help support children. And I'm going to be doing the PANDA support approach in two ways. One is conceptually how schools and colleges can introduce it and help create it as part of their culture, but also how you can work with individual children using a PANDA approach. But before I go any further, I will introduce myself properly. My name is Drew Howard. I'm currently I've got to remember my own job title now, it changes quite frequently, I'll be honest with you. I'm currently the Director of Primary Curriculum and Pedagogy at the Broad Horizons Education Trust. We're currently based out of Sewell Park, and there's 18 schools within our trust, including 3 secondary schools, 2 special schools, specialist provision schools, and the rest of the maths I'll let you work out, and they're primaries and infant schools. That's 13, by the way, in case you... The PDA profile is categorized by these four aspects. Okay? Not just these 4 aspects, but the resistance of ideas of ordinary life. Now, this means that for the individual person with a PDA profile, it's their concept, their understanding, and what creates their anxiety around 1 or 2 small aspects that they cannot then follow. That's one of the key things to it. There is a rigidity sometimes with an ASD profile. With PDA, a lot of the research has noticed that there is a rigidity within certain flashpoints, certain rub points during a day, certain rub points during an hour that they may take across. One of the key other factors that is listed on the board, and I've put it in inverted commas, is I'm a bit busy now. Now, this is a phrase that my son uses. It's a phrase that he uses when he's read and pulled every single book off the shelf and is just sitting there in his room with a pile of books around him, not reading anymore. And I can walk in and say something along the lines of, "Do we think it's time to tidy up the books now?" And he'll just look at me and say, "I'm a bit busy now." And then he might fold his arms and look in the other direction. And it's that sort of distraction, that's kind of element of a PDA profile, where it's not just he doesn't want to do it, there is a certain amount of anxiety, and we know that when to push, and this is where we start to think about some of the practical solutions through it. And then there comes the excessive mood swings, and I'll bring this back to anybody's understanding of this, which is that sometimes a rub point is around an attachment to an object or a person. Anybody who was unlucky enough to walk past my house on Wednesday evening when you just heard the phrase over and over again, "I want my laptop. I want my laptop," for, it was about 2.5 hours, actually. We see these in schools, we see this in things. It's because there is a rub point. There is a point in time where the PDA profile kicks in and they have a demand avoidance around having, not having, and that's where the rigidity comes from. And also this leads on to one of the fourth points up there, which is the obsessive behaviours. And it's often focused on other people, and these obsessive behaviours can be because they desperately want somebody's attention. They desperately want somebody's approval. Or it can be a relationship that they are so avoidant of that person that they will do anything to be in the same room as them, or anything to do in the same space, building. And if we think about that in terms of then the concept of a mainstream school and all the myriad of different people that you have to interact with during a standard school day, that suddenly leads to a whole number of rub points, of flash points that can cause, again, the excessive mood swings. So one of the key things that I'd like to start with now for the PANDA acronym. That's why there was a panda on that previous page. Okay. It wasn't just there because I've got a mild obsession with loving pandas. It's there because there is a PANDA acronym that I use, and it's from the PDA Society. If anybody's familiar with that, please raise your hand if you want to. If you're not, fantastic, thank you. I'm going to be explaining it in, as I said, in two ways. One is how we then think about it in schools, how we then think about it in a mainstream school, and then how we think about it for individuals. So I will flip between talking about how I use it with Keir and how I use it in schools. The P stands for picking your battles. And with the PDA profile of pushing against certain things, we can't pick and fight and win every single battle. And one of the key things about this is that we think about having in a school the number of rules that we've got. They need to be simplified and they need to be absolutely minimized. And the key bit for that is that you will never, ever, ever create a set of rules for a school that can include everyone without adaptation. And this means something really, really key, which means if the rules for the vast majority of people is to line up outside the classroom and move in, as and when you're given the signal to, this might not work. This might be that the PDA child has the alternative option of walking in through a different door. They have an alternative concept of coming in through a different way or approaching something with a different hat on. Some schools are good at this. Some schools, there still leaves a lot of work to be done because they still think it's just the child acting out in a certain situation. For the child themselves, it's a great idea to explain the reasons behind it. Okay? It's vital when you're picking the battle, when you're going, we need, in inverted commas, you to do this, this is what we want the outcome to be. You need to explain some reasoning behind it. This is because there's a cognitive element and a reasoning element that does go on between in the PDA profile for the choices to be made. And obviously then offering some form of choice and some form of control is absolutely vital. And this can be down to something as simple as thinking long term about what you want the actual outcome to achieve. So when I conceptualize this for schools, it's what is the actual learning you want the child to be able to do at the end of the lesson? Because if they're not engaging with it now, with the actual activity, and there is that massive difference between the activity that you want the pupils to engage with and the actual learning outcome, you think, pick the battle, what do you want them to do? Engage with the activity or the outcome? And thinking about engaging with the outcome of what you want them to learn is far better than thinking about them getting into an activity that may be the point that causes the excessive mood swings and the real digging your heels in, and the mood swings and the outbursts that come from that. So it's about offering choice, because then you're reducing some elements of anxiety and reducing some elements and providing some form of control for something that they feel very, very passionately about. The next aspect that I'm going to come on to he says, making sure that his notes are freely available to him, centres around anxiety management. This is where the PDA profile is quite contentious. And this is because there is a distinct concept, a distinct idea that some psychologists have come to, that there is a parallel run between the ASD umbrella and some attachment ideals that come through with the anxiety management, some attachment trauma that may be there. Now, this means that we do need to reduce uncertainty, and we need to explain exactly what is about to come up and what to expect. And it's important that schools start to think ahead. And one of the key things for this is not just restricted to a visual timetable. Quite often, the visual timetable, I can see people smiling here and going, yep, quite often the visual timetable is moving, it's there, it just becomes a piece, it just becomes a thing in and around the wall. They say, well, first it's maths and then it's this. You might need to actually delve a bit deeper into what the structure of those hours might look like. It might be that, okay, to reduce anxiety, we know that, and this is where knowing the person with the profile is so important. Because if you know the person's profile, you might know that the hall is a flashpoint. So therefore, we need to think, can some of this learning be done not in the hall? Is it absolutely vital that it is? But if we are to go into the hall, can we plan that ahead and reduce the anxiety? Can we reduce the uncertainty about what the individual is going to be feeling? And this involves thinking about the usual way that children respond to sensory triggers, and really using, quite often there is a massive link between the high arousal that triggers things like panic attacks, that triggers mood and resistance. So if we can keep a low arousal environment, it does enable the anxiety to be a lot lowered. So if we think about moving into a hall, if we think about moving into certain areas around a school where suddenly it becomes that absolute huge flood, thinking and getting the staff in schools and the culture in the school to think through their day in that step-by-step way of where are these trigger points for this person going to be, and then adapting and managing it through, we can help. We can really help to think about the anxiety that they're going to be experiencing. And then we also need to acknowledge that the people dealing with this will experience their own anxiety. So I'll give a very, very real and very, very current example. I'm experiencing a lot of anxiety around taking my son and 2 daughters over to Ireland in 3 days' time. We're driving in a car, we're getting on the ferry in Fishguard, and I know he's never been on that dark bit of the ferry before. And here is the bit that I've got anxiety about, so I need to manage my own anxiety about this. One of his favourite places is the car park at the Forum. I don't know why. One of his least favourite places is the car park at the View. Now, when going into a big ferry, we're going to be going into the equivalent of a car park. I've told him we're going into the equivalent of a car park, and I've said it'll be a bit like the Forum. I hope it is for him, because otherwise it could become quite an overwhelming sensory experience. If not, I've got all the management processes and the talking round that I can use, plus the standard, plus his standard headphones, his noise cancelling headphones, where he will listen to, I think it's Blur at the moment he's listening to. I have no idea why. But this is part of the thinking ahead. So for schools, we think ahead during the day. And this is what we encourage the schools to do for people with a PDA profile. We really think ahead, think of where those flashpoints might be, think of where we can reduce anxiety. Talking about it beforehand does have some, but you need to know the child, the pupil, because otherwise it may have the adverse effect. And this is going to come into the next slide, which, you know, is all about negotiation and collaboration. And I'm going to leap right on to the third word here, which is trust. This is where, again, the contentiousness and the concept that the PDA profile may have some attachment areas to it. At the moment, I'm not going to say which one it is. I'm not in a position to do that. All I know is that the DSM-5 and has PDA listed, and that the psychologists are discussing things, and they're saying that it might be this, it might be that. I'm not saying one way or the other. But negotiation means reducing options to a set number, okay? Again, this makes it go back to the control aspect. But the trust needs to be there between the person with PDA and the adults scenario situation that are working with them. For schools, this is one of the most difficult aspects, because the relationship needs to be built, but it might take time. It might also take negotiation. It might take a lot of collaboration, but it also needs the person who is, or the people who are working with the child with PDA, to gain their trust, to gain their understanding, and also they need to be willing to work with them. And the chopping and changing, and when there are changes, because sometimes it doesn't work, and we have to acknowledge that, but allowing a staff culture to become engendered to, okay, this might not be working, let's look at why it's not working, let's consider how we're going to change it. That needs to be managed in a thought-through, step-by-step fashion. Because if it's not, all that the child experiences is another adult, another adult, another adult. And again, that doesn't help anxiety. And again, it doesn't help us to pick the battles that we're going to try and get through. And one of the largest things I always say, from my own experience with everything, is trying to keep calm. And my word, is that difficult. It's very, very difficult, because sometimes for us as adults working with people, this might seem, and especially in schools where it might seem irrational, where people are saying, oh, they're just naughty. And if that phrase, I'm so sick of hearing that phrase. As a cultural concept, I find it grating beyond the pale, because there are significant reasons, there's significant understanding that people have, so they're not just naughty. And changing that culture around in a school, it takes time, it takes understanding, and it takes planning. And that's why Panda can quite help with this, because it gives people a framework, and this is what Panda is. It's a framework to operate within. It's not a blueprint. If it was a blueprint, you would follow it exactly and it would work every single time. But it's not. It's a framework. It's some rules in which we play. The next bit is disguising, masking, and managing demands. Obviously, to reduce the directness of things, we really need to manage requests. Again, this is not just similar to PDA, it's similar to ASD strategies. It's about phrasing things in a non-threatening, indirect fashion. The phrase one of the phrases that we have found working quite often is, let's see if we. Let's see if we. It's then not you. Can you do this? Not you, I'm doing it to me. It's let's see if we. And if there's that trust between the adult and the child, if there's that ideals and those concepts, then there might be a way through. Working with somebody together on something, so I will go back to the book analogy. Well, it's not even an analogy, it's my reality a lot of the time. Let's see if we can put the books back on the shelf, Keir. We pick up the books, I start putting them back on. A few moments later, he will come and join in sometimes he won't. I might then stop putting the books back on the shelf, walk away, and then come back a little later and say, let's see if we can put the books back on the shelf. By the way, Keir's book, the book stacking technique he uses is, let's just say, quite random. Spines, who would have thought that they need to face out, or even the books needs to be vertical on the shelf? I mean, it doesn't matter, the books are back on the shelf. That's picking your battles. I'm not going to go through and say the books need to be in this way or this order. God forbid, they'll all be on the floor the next day anyway. But for schools, that's the same thing. If things can just be put away that you've been asked to, and let's do it together. But this is part of trial and error with this. There's a huge amount of trial and error. We need to find what works and change when we need to make it change. This is about adapting situations to people with a PDA profile. Not all of them, because you still have to have some bits, but where we need to, and that goes back to that P. And finally, the last A is about adaptation. One of the most difficult things that schools have is time. Just a quick show of hands here. If you work in and around education, could you put your hands up, please, just to see who? Fair few. And I'm pretty sure at any sort of staff meeting, anytime you're talking to teachers, support staff, anyone around in and around education, one of the key problems they always have is there's not enough time. No, there isn't. It is a wicked problem. But how we then think about changing the culture to allow, and this is the key bit, thinking long term. What is it we actually want them to, what we want the pupils to learn? And it doesn't have to be necessarily in that way of doing it and engaging in that activity. I am talking about very, very small numbers of people with a PDA profile across our trust. And it is becoming more prevalent in and around schools. But then we need to think about how we can empower people who work with these young people to make sure that the key threads, those golden nuggets of what they need to learn, are the ones that are engaged with. Not always the activity that's set, it's the learning behind it. And obviously, with the adaptation, distraction and humour, if that trust is there, is absolutely vital, because it also helps engender trust. The Panda concept, the Panda framework, we have found very useful. We've found it to be a very positive way of reconceptualizing ideas to people, to schools, to individuals, to anyone who's working with children with a PDA profile. The key thing is keep the long-term goal in mind. Allow plenty of time. Think about the underlying concepts, because they are the things you want to pick on, to choose, to reduce anxiety, to make sure that you can negotiate, and we can use our elements of distraction to really help individuals. I'm now done. It's half an hour. I think I did quite well at timing. If anybody wants to contact me directly, that's my email address. I do check it fairly regularly. Are there any questions that anybody wants to ask at this point? Hello.
Hi, my son hasn't got a diagnosis yet.
Yeah.
But when he was 6, he had a psychological assessment. They said, no, he's fine. You know, he's got bad behaviour, these kind of things that you talked about.
Yeah.
And I've read a about PDA and thought, hey, this kind of matches him.
Yeah.
And at the time they said he can't possibly have PDA, he's not autistic, he hasn't been diagnosed with autism. So anyway, we're now 2 years forward, it looks like he is now having a diagnosis of autism. But is that correct, that really only goes with the autism spectrum, or?
Okay. All I can say is that the DSM-5 diagnosis, psychological diagnosis, it puts PDA under that umbrella of ASD. Okay, that's at the moment. So, and this is why I say it's quite contentious as to where it fits. Okay, but all I can say is that at the moment that's where it fits on that, on underneath that ASD umbrella, basically. The thing is that there is that sort of that jar, whereas quite often the rigidity, and this is one of the things that people have found, is that quite often the rigidity that's usually associated with ASD isn't usually present in people with a PDA profile. They have rigidity around certain aspects that they want to avoid. They don't necessarily have it for huge aspects of their lives, and that's where it's quite a complex issue. I can't give any more. I'm really sorry to. Thank you. Hi.
I have to say, it's sort of, I actually work in foster care, and I've taken in a PDA,
Yeah.
Young lady, and I think it's quite difficult because they present in such a neurotypical way, but actually there is so much going on behind it, so then it makes it very difficult to diagnose.
Yeah.
And then, like you say, with having to work that framework all the time because you can't leave it.
You can't. It's exhausting, isn't it?
So, yeah, it is exhausting. And
Yeah.
actually you go, we have this moment at home when it goes quiet and nobody speaks and the TV doesn't go on and we just go, because it is relentless.
Yeah.
So I think that's the big thing, is that everybody is, quite often with a PDA profile, so hard to spot it. It's
hard to spot it, and you know, let's be honest here, it's emotionally draining. And if we can imagine, with, you know, just taking in some empathy here, it's emotionally draining for us and it's emotionally draining for the person with the PDA profile. You think about that anxiety, that flooding that they get all the time for certain aspects. It's draining for them and it's draining for us.
Well, it's interesting when you were saying about triggers. I haven't really sort of honed into that, but for our young lady, it's actually transition. It's moving from one place to another, and school is a nightmare for her.
Yeah.
Because it's school buses, it's the whole thing. So by the time she's got to school, she's exhausted.
Yes.
And then they're going to say, and now we want you to perform.
Yeah.
It's
And this is where working with the school and saying, actually, the expectation around what is it you actually want them to learn, what is it you actually want them to get involved with and engaged with. Fundamentally, it's what you actually want them to learn when they come in that day.
And it took us a while, because it was only COVID, actually, when she was isolated in a room with her. So saw a different child, so calm, so collected. But the minute we go back to that input, it can be off the scale.
Exactly, and this is where that PDA profile is, is so difficult, because there is the specificity. I can speak, honest. The specificity of individuals' demand avoidance, but transitions are quite often a core one. Sorry, young.
I was only going to say that it can manifest that way, but it also can manifest where they are coping at school.
Yeah.
And they're not coping at home, and then people are looking at you, the parent, as the problem.
Yeah.
And we had that. My son's a young adult now.
Yes.
But he was diagnosed by age 5, and the school looked at when I gave the diagnosis. But he's not avoiding demands, but then they saw what he was like during the transition when I came to pick him up and take him home. And then you get the social workers who, you don't fall under the Children with Disabilities team if you have autism, therefore you're at the locality team.
Yeah.
I mean, they're looking out for child protection issues, they're not looking out for disability issues, and so they're looking at you as you're the problem and not wanting to put the support in. And that's where the attachment issue comes in, because they're assuming you've done something wrong as a parent, as opposed to...
And I totally and I completely hear what you're saying, because quite often it feels like a blame thing, doesn't it? For parents with it and anybody interacting with it, it feels like a very, very large blame with people looking.
Because suddenly it just snapped one day.
Yeah.
And they were, and And they blamed me because I kept him 2 days extra on a holiday, and that's what turned him. And
Yeah.
they were, you know, and then they were running for a EHCP or a Satan. And then suddenly it did happen at school, and he was
Yeah.
excluded, and he did have to go into special schools. You know.
Yeah, and I totally get that, and it's that thing around the parental bit as well, which is, I mean, if anybody had seen, because for some reason my son didn't quite understand that when I took him to Stonehenge this summer, he didn't quite understand why I wasn't allowed to go over the ropes. And so therefore the looks that we got when I'm trying to keep him from going over the ropes was quite intense, but you have to take a step back. I'm not quite sure what, there's about 7 minutes, and I know that somebody's starting at 1. I'll wait around outside here for a little while if anybody wants to grab and talk to me, but thank you very much for listening, and thank you.